Petrol has always been more than just fuel for vehicles. It's the lifeblood of industry, transport, and even daily life. So, when there are disruptions in its supply, the effects can be felt across the country. Today we'll take a closer look at the fuel strikes that have shaped the UK, from the 70s right through to the modern day. Our first stop in history is the 1973 oil crisis. This event marked the first major fuel crisis in the UK. The global political landscape was tense. The Yom Kippur War in the Middle East had just broken out, and in response, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, imposed an oil embargo on Western nations. The result? Global oil prices skyrocketed, and in the UK, this led to panic buying and fuel rationing. Fuel wasn't just expensive, it was becoming scarce. The UK government implemented a 3-day workweek to save energy, while many petrol stations ran dry. But what sparked the most dramatic events was how reliant the country was on foreign oil. Nearly 80% of the UK's oil came from the Middle East at the time. This crisis sowed the seeds of unrest among workers, especially those in industries dependent on cheap energy. The effects of this energy crisis weren't limited to just the price at the pumps. Industrial workers, particularly coal miners, demanded higher wages to offset rising living costs. In 1974, the miners went on strike, and the lack of coal further exacerbated the energy shortages. The government fell into a deeper crisis, which eventually contributed to the downfall of Edward Heath's Conservative government. It wasn't the last time fuel would be at the heart of national unrest, though. Let's fast forward to the early 2000s for the next big wave of fuel strikes. The fuel protests of September 2000 marked one of the most dramatic disruptions in modern UK history. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a coordinated demonstration that sent shockwaves through the country. Rising fuel prices, driven by increased fuel duty and global oil costs, had pushed hauliers and farmers to their breaking point. They decided to take matters into their own hands in a way that hadn't been seen before. The protests began with blockades at key oil refineries and fuel distribution depots. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was carefully planned. Hauliers used their lorries to obstruct access to sites like the Stanlow oil refinery in Cheshire, one of the largest fuel suppliers in the country. Similar blockades were set up across the UK, effectively cutting off the nation's fuel supply chain. The impact was immediate and widespread. Within 48 hours, up to 3,000 petrol stations were either completely out of fuel or rationing supplies. Long queues formed at those stations still operating, with some drivers sleeping in their cars overnight to secure a tank of petrol. Supermarkets and businesses began to feel the strain too, as deliveries of food and other essentials were delayed. The government, led by Tony Blair, had no choice but to intervene. After a week of chaos, the protesters eased off after promises to reconsider fuel duty, but the event raised a critical point. The UK's dependency on fuel was absolute. A disruption in supply could grind the nation to a halt. One of the most significant flashpoints was the blockade at Stanlow. Protesters, primarily farmers and hauliers, camped out in front of the refinery for days. Their message was simple but powerful. They demanded a reduction in fuel duty, which accounted for a large portion of the rising fuel costs. The blockade was so effective that it brought fuel deliveries to a standstill across much of the north of England. The protests revealed just how fragile the UK's fuel supply chain really was. As petrol stations ran dry, panic buying ensued. In London, some drivers paid up to £5 per litre for petrol from opportunistic sellers.
In just 6 days, a fairly disorganised group has brought the country to a virtual standstill. The chaos the demonstrations have left behind will take weeks to resolve. 80% of petrol stations have now run dry.
Supermarkets saw surges in customers stockpiling food, with shelves emptying quickly. The disruption wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a glimpse of how dependent modern life is on an uninterrupted flow of fuel. The government considered deploying the army to ensure fuel supplies to emergency services. Army tanker drivers were put on standby to deliver fuel if the blockades continued. However, this plan was never fully enacted, as the protests began to lose momentum after a week.
Good morning. It does look as if the fuel protest is ending in Essex, certainly at the major BP refinery. Demonstrators outside the refinery near Corringham wrote to Tony Blair with a 24-hour ultimatum last night. But in view of what's happening elsewhere in the country, they look set to call off their action this morning.
Initially, there was significant public support for the protesters. Rising fuel prices were a concern for everyone, and the protesters tapped into widespread frustration with high taxation. The media played a pivotal role, with constant coverage of empty petrol stations and interviews with stranded motorists. However, as the chaos unfolded, support began to wane, particularly as essential services like ambulances faced challenges accessing fuel. After a week of blockades, the protesters stepped down, but their message had been heard loud and clear. The government promised to review fuel taxation policies, although little immediate action followed. The protests did, however, serve as a wake-up call about the vulnerability of the UK's fuel infrastructure and the deep public resentment over rising fuel costs. So why have fuel prices continued to climb, even though fuel strikes have become less common? To understand this, we need to look at three key factors: taxation, global oil prices, and supply chain disruptions. Firstly, fuel tax. In the UK, a significant portion of what we pay at the pump goes to the government. In fact, around 60% of the price of petrol or diesel is tax. Over the decades, successive governments have raised fuel duty as a means of generating revenue and incentivizing greener transport. Secondly, the global price of oil. This fluctuates due to political instability, natural disasters, or changes in supply and demand. For example, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, oil prices soared, pushing UK fuel prices over £1 per litre for the first time ever. Since then, prices have continued to rise, with peaks during times of conflict in oil-producing regions and global events like the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, the pandemic caused a rare drop in fuel prices due to reduced demand as the world went into lockdown. However, this was short-lived. As economies recovered, supply chains struggled to keep up with demand, leading to another spike in prices in 2021 and 2022, made worse by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, we can't talk about fuel without talking about the vehicles that deliver it. The fuel tanker is a remarkable machine, designed to safely transport highly flammable liquids across long distances. Early fuel tankers, dating back to the 1920s, were much smaller and less sophisticated than today's giants. These vehicles were crucial during the World Wars, ensuring that tanks, trucks, and planes were supplied with the fuel they needed for the front lines. Fast forward to the modern era, and fuel tankers have become highly specialized. Most modern fuel tankers are made from aluminium alloys, making them lightweight but strong. They're designed with safety in mind, with multiple compartments inside to prevent the liquid from sloshing around too much, a phenomenon known as liquid surge that can destabilize the vehicle. Some fuel tankers are equipped with vapor recovery systems, which capture and prevent harmful fuel vapors from escaping into the atmosphere. This is all part of the modern push toward reducing environmental impact. And let's not forget the sheer size of some of these tankers. They can carry up to 40,000 litres of fuel in a single trip. Fuel tankers may not get the attention they deserve, but these vehicles keep the wheels of society turning. From delivering petrol to your local station to refueling planes at airports, tankers are essential to ensuring that fuel is where it's needed, when it's needed. So, what's the future for fuel strikes and rising fuel costs? With the UK committed to phasing out petrol and diesel cars by 2030, we may see a gradual reduction in our reliance on fossil fuels. However, as the transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy picks up speed, new challenges could emerge. Fuel prices may remain volatile in the short term, and as we've seen with recent protests, supply chain disruptions can still have a massive impact on everyday life. However, with advancements in energy technology, the hope is that future generations will be less reliant on the kinds of fuel that sparked so much unrest in the past. Fuel has been at the heart of some of the UK's most disruptive strikes and protests, but it's also driven innovation. From the design of tankers to the quest for alternative energy, tankers shape the world we live in. They provide us with the right to freedom, to travel anywhere we like, any way we like. Whether or not the push for a more sustainable option works out, it seems the unrest and strike action is on hold for now. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to stay tuned for more deep dives into rare and unusual vehicles here on Classic Garage.